Mr. Deedy, in this frame, what has happened before is that you've gotten Mr. Eldert's attention away from Mr. Gutowski, correct?
Immediately preceding this frame?
No, between the frames that we just saw and this one.
Between those frames, I yelled, "Stop, I'll shoot." And Mr. Elders then turned to me.
And he has walked towards you, correct?
He did.
And I believe you testified that when he was walking towards you, he was walking slowly.
In my mind, it was a very slow and deliberate movement towards me.
While he was walking towards you in that slow and deliberate manner that you described, had you already pulled your gun?
No, I was in the process of drawing my gun.
When he was walking towards you?
Yes, I was doing a close quarters draw, which you put one arm forward, reach for your weapon, establish a grip, pull up the gun, clear your holster, drop your elbow, and then tilt your wrist and make sure your body's square, and that's the draw. Between from when Mr. Eldridge turned and walked into my fist, I completed the draw.
Okay. And I believe that you testified yesterday about the technical physical movements you use with that close quarters draw. Do you remember your testimony about that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So, have we seen a frame in which you are actually drawing your gun with that close quarters draw?
I believe so.
Can we go back, please?
It's from a different angle.
From the side dining angle?
Yes, ma'am.
Can we, first of all, what frame is this?
This is 24206.
Okay, and your gun is being drawn at this point in time?
Yes, ma'am.
And if we can switch to the side dining angle, please? I'm sorry, side dining view.
Yes.
And the frame number, please?
This is 24207.
So it's right after the one that we have just seen, but from a different view, is that correct?
That's correct.
At this point in time, your gun is already drawn?
Yes, that's correct.
Has it already been fired?
No, ma'am.
Because as we see your right hand and arm positioned here, that's not the correct position for a close quarter draw, is it?
I believe that I testified that this looked like it was a split second before the draw was complete. When you do a close quarters draw, after the gun has cleared the holster, you drop your back elbow and then you tilt your wrist up.
And your position now is your back elbow is as close to the waist as you can get it?
The idea is to keep it in tight so that when you point the gun, it's square with the individual in front of you.
Okay, and in this particular frame that we're looking at here, your forearm and elbow are not close to your waist, correct? They're higher than your waist.
It looks like the draw is not quite complete. It looks like the elbow still hasn't quite dropped down to below to its final resting place.
Okay, and in this particular view, Mr. Eldert's hands are not on the gun, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you go back to, well, let's just go forward and see what we can see from this view. This and the time, please.
2:42, 8.6 seconds.
And by this time, you have already fired the first shot, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And please change back to the capture view. And go back to a frame. And another frame, please. And Mr. Deedy, the time again.
2:42:06.15.
So this again is where you're reaching for your gun in the back, correct?
I believe that this is as the gun is being drawn up out of the holster.
And this was after you had told him that you were going to shoot him?
I issued a warning that I would shoot. I said, stop, I'll shoot. And as he approached, came to my arm, I said freeze, and put my gun.
Okay, and you can take your seat. And at this point in time, Mr. Eldert's arms are at his side, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And he has no weapon.
I did not see a weapon in his hand.
Did you see a weapon in either of his hands?
His hands, no, ma'am.
And can we go forward, please? And the time, please.
2:42:08.
And so by this time, the first shot has already been fired, correct?
That's correct.
When you pulled that gun and pointed it at Mr. Eldert's and told him to freeze, you intended to use it, correct?
Ma'am, when I drew the gun, I said freeze before the gun was drawn. I had my arm out, completed my draw, and it was like time stood still. We stood there. I was in fear for Adam's life. I was in fear for my life. I was on the brink of making a decision whether or not to use deadly force. As a law enforcement officer, this is a moment I've dreaded from the start of my career. Once you make that decision, you pull the trigger, you can't ever go back. But I made an oath to serve and protect, and that's what I did.
Okay, Mr. Deedy, when you pulled the trigger, you intended to kill Mr. Eldert's, correct?
I intended to stop the threat.
Mr. Deedy, stopping the threat meant killing Mr. Eldert's, correct?
Not necessarily.
Mr. Deedy, you are taught, you are trained that when you shoot to kill, correct?
We are trained to shoot center mass of an available target to stop the threat. And if that, whatever that target may be, fully aware that shooting and killing will stop the threat.
You are not taught to shoot to maim, correct?
Our intentions when we shoot the gun is to stop the threat, knowing fully that that will kill somebody, very likely kill someone. We are not intending to simply maim or injure.
Mr. Deedy, before you pulled your gun, in this first instance when you pulled the gun, I'm sorry, let me take that back. You said that you pulled the gun and fired it at Mr. Eldert's because you feared for Mr. Mr. Gutowski's life, correct?
That was one of the reasons why I escalated to deadly force.
So then, does that mean that you felt that you would have been justified in shooting Mr. Medeiros at this point, since he was attacking Mr. Gutowski?
I issued the command for them to stop, and that I would shoot to stop. When I did that, Mr. Elders came and attacked me. He was my immediate threat.
Mr. Deedy, because you pulled the gun at a time when you thought Mr. Medeiros needed protection, did that mean that you thought you were assessing the situation such that you felt that you could shoot or use deadly force against Shane Medeiros because he was beating on Mr. Gutowski?
When I issued the warning, stop, I'll shoot, the warning was because both Mr. Medeiros and Mr. Elders were using deadly force against Mr. Gutowski. Yes.
So you would have been justified in shooting Mr. Medeiros as well?
Objection speculative.
I'm asked.
It would have been reasonable use of force to shoot either of the assailants that were using deadly force against Mr. Gutowski.
Mr. Deedy, Did it ever occur to you as one of your options while you were assessing the situation after you stood up to go and just go physically over to your friend Adam Butowski and pull one or more of the people who you say were assaulting him off of him?
We're trained that when you...
No, Mr. Deedy, I'm just asking you, did that ever occur to you to do?
It occurred to me that I needed to stop the deadly force that was being used against Mr. Gutowski. In order to do so...
Mr. Deedy, did it ever occur to you that one of the ways that you could have stopped the force against Mr. Gutowski was to physically go over to him and pull either Mr. Medeiros away or Mr. Eldritz away?
That would not have been a safe option for myself and Mr. Gutowski.
Mr. Deedy, did you ever consider that as an option?
Yes, I did.
And Mr. Deedy, you have seen in the video after you fired the first shot at Mr. Eldritz that Jessica West became involved in that fight between Shane Medeiros and Adam Gutowski, correct?
Yes.
And you have also seen Joey Keene on the video as well as heard him testify that he became involved between Shane Medeiros and Mr. Gutowski, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And between the two of them, they were able actually to push Mr. Medeiros out the door and down the ramp, correct?
After I had already stopped Mr. Eldritz from continuing his use of force against Mr. Gutowski.
And Mr. D, Ms. West did not receive any serious injuries from her intervention, did she?
No, she did not.
And Mr. Joey Keene never received any injuries from his intervention, did he?
I don't believe that he testified he did.
And Mr. Gutowski did not receive serious injuries from from the assault that you have described on him that morning, correct?
My actions prevented him from receiving serious bodily injury or death.
Mr. Deedy, the injuries that Shane Medeiros received that night were not serious, were they?
I'm sorry. Shane, did you just ask?
I misspoke. Mr. Deedy, I'm not trying to confuse you.
I know.
Pardon
Yes,
me.
ma'am, actually.
Mr. Deedy, Adam Gutowski never received serious injury from what happened that morning, did he?
No, he didn't.
You testified yesterday about the close quarters shot, correct?
Close quarters shot, yes, ma'am.
Close quarters drop. And you said that the reason you use that is because somebody is close to you, the assailant.
Yes, that's one of the reasons.
And in fact, that's something that Mr. Amiano described as well, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
How far away was Colin Eldritz from you when you pulled the trigger and fired the first shot?
1 arm's length.
And you missed him.
That's correct.
After you fired the first shot at Colin Eldritz, he then moved close to you, correct? Or was he just maintained his same distance from you?
As I fired the shot, Mr. Eldritz was moving.
Okay.
He was moving to his left and then came around in the same direction as the cashier counter.
Can you please look at that one, please? Okay, stop. And the time, please.
2:42:09.
Is this what you moved around towards the cashier counter, what we see here?
Yes, in the direction after he changed his body position and we moved parallel to approximately to the cashier counter.
And you've already testified that we see here Colin Eldritz's left hand on your right wrist, correct?
His left arm is on my wrist arm area, yes.
Okay. And the position that you have your gun in at this point in time, that's not the close quarter draw position, is it?
No, it's not.
And then from here, both you and Elders fell on the floor, correct?
He drove me to the ground.
And you both fell down
Yes, that's correct.
behind that soda machine, in between the booth where you were seated and that machine.
That's correct.
Move forward, please. And perhaps if we can move to the dining room. Oh, can you go back? Okay, time on this, Mr. Deedy, please.
2:42:09.
Can we go forward? Stop, please. Time frame, please.
2:42:12.
You see Mr. Bird,
Yes, I do.
and did you know where he was when you fell to the ground?
No, ma'am.
So you didn't realize that he was kind of behind that, what you've been calling the toy display, and in the area where your head would have been after you landed.
No, I did not know he was behind the toy display.
Please go forward. Can we stop here? And may we have the time, please?
2:42:18.
And Mr. Deedy, you've explained that at this point in time, Mr. Elders was, I believe you said punching you, is that right?
I don't believe I testified to this frame. I believe I testified that while we were on the ground, he was punching me.
Okay, in this time frame.
At the time, he was punching me while I was on the ground.
Okay.
I don't have a sense of time of how long it lasted and how many exact punches he threw and where in each punch is being thrown.
Right. And, okay, can we move forward? Please stop it. And before we go on, Mr. Deedy, can you tell, or having watched this video hundreds of times, I'm sorry, I'm not going to refer to this specifically. I just want to ask a question not related to the video per se. So, Mr. Deedy, can you tell, having watched the video over 100 times, at what point in time the second and third shots were fired per the video?
No, I can't tell that.
Okay. So can we keep going forward, please? Stop. And the time, please.
It's 2:42:32.
And you see Mr. Keene in that photo.
Yes, I did.
And by this time, all three shots have been fired, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you said that Mr. Medeiros had dropped onto you after.
I'm sorry, I believe you mean Mr. Elders.
Yes, I do. I'm sorry. Dropped onto you.
Yes. In the midst of coming down for a punch, it wasn't a complete punch. He just came down.
And he fell face down on top of you.
Yes.
And you said that when he was punching you, you had your head off the ground.
I was trying to keep my head off the ground
And okay.
while he was punching me. When I took the last shots, I was able to get myself upwards a bit.
In a more upright position,
Yes, that's correct.
more seated.
Not
Or
really.
What do you mean by upright?
Trying to raise my head, shoulders, and chest off of the ground, like doing a crunch, except with my legs flat on the ground.
You heard Mr. Bird testify that when you fell,
Excuse me, who has that? Please have him turn off those devices before he comes in. I'm sorry, go ahead.
you've heard Mr. Bird testify that when you fell, your head was up against the high chair backs that were stored where you fell, correct?
I also heard him testify that he testified in the grand jury that he never saw us when we hit the ground because the only thing he could see was the back of the toy display.
Mr.
So yes, I did hear that. Sorry.
Was your head up against the chairs, the high chairs that were stored in that area?
I remember my head hitting what I thought was the ground. I can't be certain if it hit the ground and ever moved back to the high chairs. I just don't know.
So they may have been, your head may have been on the high chairs, correct?
I don't believe it was. When my head hit, it hit really hard.
But you just said you don't remember.
I said I can't be certain. I didn't see my head hit.
You fired 2 more shots, you testified,
Yes, ma'am.
and each time you fired those 2 shots, you meant to kill Mr. Elders, correct?
I meant to stop his assault on me.
You meant to fire at a place where you knew the bullet would likely kill him, correct?
I knew that those shots could kill him.
And with respect to the 2 more shots that you fired, how far away was your gun from Mr. Elders when those 2 shots were fired?
I don't know exactly. It was as he was coming down for a punch, I believe.
Would you say it was within 10 inches of Mr. Elders?
Yes, our bodies were very close to each other.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
And yet, one of those 2 other shots that you fired missed him, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And would it be fair to say that you had no idea who might have been in the line of fire of any of those 2 shots besides Mr. Elders?
While I was firing the shots, as we're trained to do, you look at your target and what's beyond. And directly behind him, facing up, the direction I was shooting, there was no one there.
You were shooting up.
Yes, it was from on the ground upwards towards Mr. Elders as he was coming back and then coming down.
Did you try to fire more than 3 shots?
No, I didn't.
Your 3rd shot jammed, correct?
The third shot, the casing did not eject.
Meaning that you could not fire another shot unless you cleared the casing, correct?
If I had tried to pull the trigger, I would have got a click.
You would have had to clear the casing.
To fire another shot, yeah, I would have had to perform immediate action, do a tap and rack.
And the casing was not stovepiped. Do you know what stovepiped means?
Yes, ma'am.
The casing was not stovepiped, correct?
No, it wasn't.
Can you continue, please? Stop, please. You have the time, Mr. Deedy.
2:43 and 5 seconds.
And I believe you see yourself in this shot,
Yes, ma'am.
and you're going towards your slippers.
Yes, ma'am.
And I believe you testified that you were dazed after you shot Mr. Elders. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's how I described it.
Did your training teach you how to deal with a situation in which you felt dazed as an agent?
Our training tells us that it's very likely, and they give us many examples of how it happens. And what they train us is to try to be aware of it, and if you are aware of it, the only thing we can really do is try to shake yourself out of it and try to process and try to keep control of yourself. But it's a physiological condition. You don't necessarily have control of when it happens. It's not something you can will yourself out of.
Mr. Deedy, can we watch further, please? Time, Mr. Deedy, please.
2:43:26.
And at this point in time, you have gone back to render aid to Mr. Eldritz, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And I believe yesterday you testified that the reason you did that is because you are trained to render aid to someone that you have shot, correct?
If it is safely possible, then yes.
And that training actually mandates that you render aid immediately to someone who has been shot, that you have shot, if possible, correct?
That sounds correct.
But in this case, you did not render immediate aid.
I rendered aid as immediately as I realized that I needed to.
And in rendering this aid, are you not taught to first check for vital signs?
No, I'm not.
What you checked for when you went to see, when you went back to Mr. Eldritz was whether he was breathing or not?
That was after I had established that there was one gunshot wound.
Can you please continue? Or actually, can you stop and move to the main?
Mr. Deedy, what I'm going to do now is to put up the Mage video, and I will get that exhibit number as soon as I have it. But you're familiar what you've been calling the Mage video, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you please move to the time when Officer Naki Can you stop it, please?
Mr. Deedy, do you have a time reference now?
I can't see one on the screen.
Let me see if we can readjust the screen so that we can get the reference. Can you see it now? I believe it's on the bottom.
I believe this is the same player we're using. It's usually in the bottom left. To the right. Yes, I can see it. The 36 seconds out of 7:59.
And this is exhibit 402. Okay, thank you, Your Honor. And Mr. Deedy, the time on this?
1 minute and 7 seconds.
Were you able to hear what was being said on this?
I was not. Just now?
Yes.
Yes.
And you heard through the police dispatcher a description of what Officer Naki was saying about the suspect?
Yes.
And you heard Officer Naki describe for the dispatcher that there was a suspect basically at large, correct?
I wasn't listening to what he was doing on his radio. There was a lot of ambient noise, And I was focused solely on what I was doing with Mr. Eldridge. I didn't hear any of that dispatch.
Okay, you've just heard it now, but you didn't hear it while you were there.
I heard now, and I believe that what he said was, all I've got is a male running down Hawaiian Avenue in a white t-shirt. I think that's what he said.
Okay, but you didn't hear any of that.
No, and hearing someone say, all I've got is a male running down Hawaiian Avenue with a white t-shirt, I heard that. I don't know what that would have meant to me.
Okay, Mr. Deedy, I'm not asking you what it would have meant to you. I'm asking whether or not you heard it at the time you were there.
No, I didn't.
Okay. Please continue. Please tell us what the time is.
1 minute and 14 seconds.
Okay, Mr. Deedy, while Officer Naki was there with you by Mr. Eldred's body, did you tell him or identify yourself as a police officer?
Yes, I did.
At what point in time? Have we seen it already on this video?
I don't believe so. We haven't watched the whole thing, but I believe it's... What I recall is the first thing he said to me that I recall was when he asked me where the shot was. And then he came back and was checking vital signs, and I reported to him my findings that he was still breathing, that there was still blood flow. I hadn't checked the pulse. And when he didn't respond, when Officer Naki didn't respond to me, I told him I was a cop. That's the word I used. Thinking that I don't know why he wasn't listening to me. I thought maybe he would get his attention to me again, and he just got up and walked away.
Mr. Deedy, so he didn't acknowledge after you told him you were a cop, correct?
He did not respond to me, no.
You expected a response.
Yes.
And being that you didn't get a response, did you think perhaps he had not heard you?
No, he was right next to me.
My question was, being that you didn't get a response to your statement to Officer Naki that you were a cop, did it not cross your mind that he did not hear you?
No, that wasn't going through my mind.
Can you continue?
Time, Mr. Deedy.
1 minute and 54 seconds.
Was it at this point in time that you told him that you were a cop?
I believe it was right before that.
Right before?
Right before this.
Okay. So you've already told him this, right?
I'm not completely certain. After I sort of got out of the daze with my slippers, I ran back in there. I was really, really focused on what I was doing. I don't have a complete, and as you said, you can see you can't hear. You can hear words being spoken, but it's hard to tell. So I can't tell if that's exactly when I said it, but I think that's when I said it.
Were you still in a daze when you were putting pressure on Mr. Eldred's wound?
Daze isn't the right word for it. It was like I kicked into training mode. Just really, really focused on trying to keep Mr. Eldridge alive.
Okay, can we continue? And that's per your training, correct? Keep the suspect alive.
To the best of your ability.
Go to after Mr. Deedy is in front of the counter with the police officers before the search.
5 minutes and 43 seconds.
Mr. Deedy, you have been called over to stand there by the police, is that right?
In this frame, I don't think that's happened yet, no.
Okay, they haven't called you yet?
They didn't call me over. As I walked there, I believe Officer Naki got my attention when I was right there.
Okay, why don't we, continue? Because, I'm sorry, so in this frame, are you saying you're still looking at your slippers or for your slippers?
I believe so. I don't see myself turning, and I can't see Officer Naki's arm on me yet.
Okay, why don't we go here? Time, please.
5 minutes and 49 seconds.
So you saw Officer Naki there put his gloved hand on you, and then this court viewed you that position we see now, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's when he began his pat-down search,
Correct?
asked you if you had any weapons or anything that could hurt you,
Yes, ma'am.
the normal things that are asked during a pat-down search.
That's correct.
And this is when you told them that you had a pistol or gun?
I told him it was on my right hip.
Okay, and then he said what?
He said, "What is?"
And you told him what?
I said, "My pistol."
And his reaction was?
What do you mean, pistol?
Can you continue, please? Stop. Time frame, please.
5:57.
And did you see Officer Naki's reaction at this point?
Yes.
How would you describe it?
Shock or alarm?
Okay. And he's grabbing the front of your shirt, is that right?
That's correct.
And is this the point at which you told him you had the pistol? Or is this the point at which you told him you had shot Colin Alberts?
Oh, this is right after I said I'm the one who shot him.
And then from this frame, they continued on to handcuff you?
First, he removed the pistol from my holster, and then he handcuffed me. Yes.
And did he tell you you were under arrest for murder?
He did not know.
Did Sergeant Schreiner?
No, they didn't.
Mr. Deedy, isn't it true that you never identified yourself as a police officer until after Sergeant Schreiner saw your wallet with the ID?
No, that's not correct.
Do you remember Sergeant Schreiner asking you if you were a special agent with the State Department?
Yes, I do.
And that was after he had pulled your, not he, but your ID had been taken from your back pocket, correct?
When Sergeant Schreiner asked me that question, all of my belongings had been pulled out of my pocket and were on that countertop.
So it was only after that that you were asked that question by Sergeant Schreiner?
Yes, yes.
Now, you testified yesterday that after the shooting, you were not giving anybody any information except for medical treatment purposes. Is that right?
No, I don't believe that's my full testimony.
Was there any other reason for you to give information to anybody after the shooting?
Yes, we're trained to cooperate with whichever law enforcement agency, whether it's your own or if you're in a local or state district. If you've been in a shooting, you're likely to be detained, and to provide biodata information, your name, your address, who you work for, what you do, things that they have a record, and if you are injured, to seek medical attention, provide anything necessary for that, but not to answer or give any statements or anything that's not absolutely necessary for that purpose.
And excuse me, you did testify though that one of the things you talk about, excuse me, one of the reasons that you would give information is for the purposes of medical treatment, correct?
Yes,
And you were taken to Queens Medical Center for the purpose of medical treatment, correct?
that's correct.
And while at that facility, you gave I think you call it data information to Nurse Nakamura, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
But you did not give accurate information, correct?
For the biodata information,
For the data or the information that you did give her related to medical treatment.
no. When she was asking questions about my medical history, I was feeling the effects of the traumatic incident. I just fought for my life, and I believe I just killed a man. And I just heard that I was under arrest for murder. When she was checking my vitals and asking social or medical history questions, she asked a number of questions. I said no to everything, even a number of questions that I should have said yes to if
And
I
that
would have been
the
paying
alcohol
attention,
consumption, correct?
as well as my history with asthma and high cholesterol.
With respect to your refusal of the felony intoxilizer, Mr. Deedy, you said that you had refused that because you hadn't had an opportunity to talk to your representative, agency representative, is that right?
I declined to take that test unless I had an agency representative at the time, or unless it was required.
And so your refusal had nothing to do with not wanting to give information regarding your blood alcohol?
No, ma'am.
Did you believe that your blood alcohol level would have been a relevant piece of information for the investigation of this particular crime?
No, I didn't. I did not believe there was a crime.
Mr. Deedy, you do recognize that the policy requires that you cooperate fully with local law enforcement, right?
Yes, that's true to the extent of giving necessary information, no statements of any type, which includes submitting to tests that are not necessary for a medical purpose, and I asked, for instance, when the technician was taking pictures and things, I asked if I was absolutely required to do so. She told me that I was, so I did.
Mr. Deedy, yesterday you testified that you did not give a statement to the police that morning because you didn't want to do so until after you had spoken with an agency representative, correct?
When the detectives asked me for a statement, I believe it was later in the afternoon around 1:30 p.m., and I told them I would like to make a statement, but I would need counsel there, an agency representative, before doing so.
And in fact, you were provided, somebody from your agency did come down to meet with you at HPD, correct?
After the meeting with detectives, yes, I was met by 2 agents from our Los Angeles field office.
And after you met with your agents from the Los Angeles field office, you did not give a statement to the police, correct?
No, they counseled me not to make a statement. They were not attorneys and they needed to consult State Department counsel.
Yesterday you testified that in your training that you received, you know that giving a statement immediately after a traumatic event can sometimes be misleading, correct?
I don't know if I use the word misleading. In our training, we're taught that after a use of force situation or deadly force is used, the body experiences many physiological changes, and you may not remember everything immediately, or you may not be in your right mind at the time, and you need to gather yourself and do it properly, because you need to report the incident as best as possible.
Does this remain true even for witnesses of the situation?
Objection made, Your Honor.
Oh, do you understand the question?
I understand the question. We are trained that when taking witness statements to keep this in mind, that what witnesses often say or report after an incident may not be completely accurate. They may not have seen the entire events. What the mind tends to do, the mind cannot remember, we're trained about this, every single thing that happens. And we're trained different things that what the mind will try to do is if they see A and C, they will try to fill in the blanks with B. Or if the statement is not taken immediately, they can take in outside sources, such as the media, and apply that to their story. So very often, witness statements, when you take them, you have to be very cognizant that they're not always completely reliable.
Mr. Deedy, are you saying that as of the time that you met with your agency representatives, you had not had an opportunity to remember all the details of what happened that morning?
That was at about 1:30 in the afternoon, and I had been going through the event in my mind the entire time, trying to make sense of exactly what happened. And my agency representatives advised me not to make a statement.
Having had 1 year and 8 months pass since the shooting, I reviewed the video hundreds of times according to your testimony. Do you now remember all the details?
I can't remember every single thing that happened or exact words, and I cannot speculate what was going through the minds of the other people there, particularly Mr. Elders. But I do know what I did and how I responded.
In reviewing the video over hundreds of times, were some of those times with your attorneys?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, during your testimony, you said numerous times that you were reassessing the situation. Do you recall that? Your mind was going 1,000 different directions.
I did say that.
And this would have been while you were at McDonald's, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And this would have been before you shot Mr. Elders, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And I believe you testified yesterday that you are still assessing the situation today, correct?
What I meant was, I think as I just said, I know what I did. I know what happened. But I still ask myself, why did certain people do what they did? Why did they do their actions? Why did they respond to me the way they did? And I'll never know that answer.
But you know that question as it relates to you, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you agree that all of the training that you have had as a DSS special agent provided you with many tools to use under various situations?
Yes.
And you described them as tools yourself, correct? The different skills that you have learned.
Yes, that's a term I recall from my FLETC training officer. They said everything you take in here, 0 tools going into a toolbox. And it's the officers, based on the totality of the circumstances, the officer has to decide which tools to employ at each moment.
So no matter how many tools you are, it's still the officer that makes the decision of which tools to use, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And in what situation, correct?
I'm sorry?
It's the officer's responsibility to determine what tool to use in each specific situation.
Yes,
And that's why you are continually assessing the situation.
that's correct.
And when assessing a situation, particularly one in which deadly force is used, you need to consider all of the whole situation, correct?
The totality of circumstances,
And all of the tools that you have.
all of your available options.
And did your team teach you that even if you follow your training 100% by the book, that does not?
After the incident, what may have been a better choice has to be about what the officer has presented, the full totality of circumstances at that moment when the force is used.
But it has to be an objective reasonableness, correct?
Objectively reasonable to an officer in those circumstances.
Not a subjective test.
That's correct. Meaning there's no perfect answer.
So basically what it comes down to is even though you use every tool that you have and you use it correctly, if an agent has made the wrong decision about what tool to use, he can be wrong, correct?
Well, I object as well.
Could you repeat the question?
What that basically means is that even if the officer uses the tools in the manner in which he is taught to use them, uses them in a correct manner, that he does not necessarily do the right thing, objectively reasonable thing in every situation.
Object as argumentative.
I disagree with that. If the officer uses the tools that he deems to be objectively reasonable at the time, then it was the correct action. Knowing something after the fact that was different than what the officer perceived based on what was in front of him, you cannot judge the officer's actions based on that if that was not available for the officer to consider. Does not make it wrong. And we are given many, many examples of what's considered a good shoot, but with facts learned afterwards, the officer may not have taken the shot.
Mr. Deedy, in your assessment of the situation at McDonald's, in your continuous assessment of the situation, isn't it true that you never once considered leaving the scene as an option to the use of deadly force?
At the time that deadly force was presented to me, it was being used against Adam Gutowski, and I raised my response level to the threat of deadly force and issued a warning.
Mr. Deedy, my question is simply, at the time that you were assessing and reassessing the situation at McDonald's, you never considered one of the tools that you could use as leaving McDonald's, correct?
No, that's not correct. When I stood up and saw Adam being kicked in the face, I could have ran. I knew I could have ran, but I could not have done that and assured his safety.
Mr. Deedy,
So I chose not to do that.
Before you were knocked to the ground by Colin Edwards, isn't it true that you never considered leaving as one of the options that you have?
Yes, I considered it as an option.
And you rejected it.
I did not deem that it was feasible.
How many times did you consider that leaving was an option and rejected it?
I don't know. I was continuously assessing the situation. And every time I did consider it, I did not believe it would be safe even for myself to leave, based on the confines of the area, options, or their described intent and their shown ability. I didn't think if I even wanted to, I could get by and be sure that I would not sustain an attack or injury.
Mr. Deedy, when you first approached Colin Elders, you were concerned about Mr. Perron, correct?
That's correct.
At that point, you could have gone and sat with Mr. Perron and called the police, correct? And waited for them to come. Isn't that right?
When I assessed the situation,
Mr. Deedy, isn't it correct that at that time you could have gone up to Mr. Perron, sat with him at his table, protected him until police came?
I believe that the proper de-escalation method was to use words.
And Mr. Deedy, those did not work, correct?
They did not immediately work.
They did not work when you spoke to Colin Elders, correct?
No.
So at that point in time, did you consider going and sitting down next to Mr. Perrine, calling the police, and waiting until they arrived?
Immediately after I spoke,
Mr. Deedy, did you consider going and sitting down to protect Mr. Perrine that you were concerned about, calling the police, and having them take care of the situation?
I responded to an immediate threat. And when there's an immediate
Mr.
threat,
Deedy.
we are trained to address the threat.
Mr. Deedy, I'm
by step-
asking you if one of your responses to addressing that immediate threat, if you considered as one of your responses to addressing that immediate threat to Mr. Perrine, to go and sit down with him, call the police, and ask them to take care of the situation.
That was not an option.
That's not an option that you considered, correct?
I considered against it.
So you considered it and you rejected it.
I chose another option.
You considered actually going and sitting down and protecting Mr. Perrine until the police came?
I considered what I did was protecting Mr. Perrine.
Mr. Deedy.
Not by sitting, but by directly addressing the threat.
Mr. Deedy, my question to you is very simple.
And it's not a yes or no question answer.
Whether or not you considered going and sitting down next to Perrine and calling the police, is that not a yes or no answer? Did you consider it?
It's not. This is an
Mr.
example.
Deedy, did you consider doing that or not?
My immediate reaction was to address the threat against Mr. Perrine. And it was not to call the police and sit down next to Mr. Perrine.
That would have addressed the issue, wouldn't it have?
No, I don't believe so.
Mr. Deedy, do you agree that if you had been following your department's policy about not drinking and carrying a firearm off duty, if you had followed that policy of not drinking and followed that policy of not having a firearm, that Mr. Elders would not have been shot dead by numerous guns in November of 2011?
Object to the formal question, assuming,
Right. It's assuming.
as assuming that the policy applied when Agent Deedy was off duty.
Yeah, and
He's already
well,
answered.
all right, that's up to the jury to decide if that's the objection.
The question assumes